Uproar, the passionate debate underway tonight about America and the death penalty, galvanized by the death of the man named Troy Davis. Last night, he was executed amid cries for mercy and his own fervent declaration of innocence.
Hey, Troy Davis, too much doubt!
Troy Davis supporters are still anguished today that their screams for mercy went unanswered, that a man they believe is innocent was killed.
Troy Davis! Troy Davis!
On September 21st, 2011, inside the execution chamber at the Georgia State Prison in Jackson, the world watched as Troy Anthony Davis was strapped to the gurney, calm, silent, and still insisting he was innocent. Moments later, the lethal injection began, bringing an end to one of the most controversial death penalty cases in modern American history. This was not a typical execution. For years, millions of people across the globe had rallied in his defense, from human rights groups to world leaders, all united by a single haunting question. What if the state of Georgia was about to execute an innocent man? Troy Davis was convicted of murdering an off-duty police officer, but over time, his case began to crumble. 7 of the 9 eyewitnesses who testified against him later recanted or changed their stories, some even claiming they had been pressured by investigators. There was no physical evidence, no gun, no fingerprints, no DNA, only testimony, and that testimony was falling apart. Despite that, the state moved forward. Protesters filled the streets outside the prison, holding candles and chanting his name. Inside, Davis maintained his innocence until the very end. As he looked toward the witnesses and the family of the victim, he said softly, "I am innocent. The truth will come out one day." At 11:08 p.m., Troy Davis was pronounced dead. But for millions around the world, the case was far from over. In this video, we'll uncover what led to that night, the crime that placed Troy Davis on death row, the evidence that divided a nation, and the execution that forced America to question the very foundation of its justice system. The story of Troy Davis began more than 2 decades before his execution on the hot summer night of August 19, 1989, in Savannah, Georgia. The city's River Street district was alive with music, crowds, and the smell of street food when a sudden argument erupted in a nearby parking lot. It started over something small. A man named Michael Cooper was being harassed by a group of young men. Moments later, a shot was fired, injuring Cooper. The crowd scattered. Not long after, in a Burger King parking lot just blocks away, tragedy struck again. Off-duty police officer Mark MacPhail, working a security shift, rushed to help a homeless man who was being assaulted. As he intervened, someone stepped forward, raised a gun, and fired 2 shots. MacPhail was killed instantly. 1 bullet to the face, another to the heart. Witnesses described the shooter as a young black man fleeing the scene. Within days, police zeroed in on one name, Troy Anthony Davis, then 20 years old. He had no prior violent record, but someone claimed to have seen him with a gun that night. When officers searched his home, they found no weapon, no fingerprints, and no physical evidence linking him to the murder. Still, the pressure to find the killer of a police officer was immense, and Davis was arrested and charged with capital murder. From the beginning, Troy insisted he was innocent. He said he was present when the chaos unfolded but had nothing to do with the shooting. Yet, as his case moved forward, witness statements began piling up, stories that would soon decide his fate. At first, it seemed open and shut. But years later, those same witnesses would tell a very different story, one that would unravel everything the jury had once believed. Troy Davis's trial began in 1991 at the Chatham County Courthouse in Savannah, Georgia. The courtroom was packed, police officers, reporters, and community members all watching closely as the young man accused of killing Officer Mark MacPhail sat quietly beside his attorneys. The prosecution's case relied almost entirely on eyewitness testimony. No physical evidence tied Troy Davis to the shooting. The murder weapon was never found. There were no fingerprints, no gunpowder residue, nothing solid. But 9 witnesses took the stand and pointed at Davis, saying they saw him shoot the officer. Their voices carried enormous weight, and in the eyes of the jury, it was enough. The defense argued that the investigation had been rushed and that police were under heavy pressure to deliver a suspect quickly after the death of a fellow officer. They highlighted inconsistencies in the witnesses' statements, descriptions that didn't match, timelines that shifted, and the possibility that one of the other men present, Sylvester "Red" Coles, might have been the real shooter. But their arguments couldn't compete with the emotional power of 9 people saying the same name: Troy Davis. When the jury returned with a guilty verdict, Davis sat still, expressionless. He was sentenced to death by lethal injection. In the gallery, Officer MacPhail's family wept, believing they had finally found justice. Outside the courthouse, some people protested, arguing that the evidence didn't prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. In the years that followed, the truth behind that verdict would begin to unravel. Witnesses who once stood firm began to recant, admitting they had been pressured or mistaken. Others claimed that another man had confessed to the murder. The state of Georgia, however, refused to reopen the case. And as the years passed, what began as one man's trial became a national question: could an innocent man be executed in America? As the years went on, the story of Troy Davis transformed from a local murder case into a global symbol of doubt in the American justice system. What began as a straightforward conviction was now collapsing under the weight of new revelations, and the world was beginning to pay attention. By the early 2000s, Troy Davis had already spent more than a decade on death row when a series of bombshell recantations began to emerge. 7 of the 9 key witnesses who had testified against him came forward and changed their stories. Some said they had been pressured by police, others admitted they were young and scared when they pointed the finger at Davis. A few went further, saying that another man, Sylvester "Red" Coles, the very person who had first named Davis as the shooter, had confessed to the crime himself. The case began to unravel in the public eye. Journalists, lawyers, and human rights activists dug through transcripts and affidavits, pointing out glaring inconsistencies. There was no murder weapon, no physical evidence, just words that were now falling apart. Soon, protests erupted across the United States and beyond. From Atlanta to London, from Paris to Johannesburg, crowds carried signs that read, "I am Troy Davis." Celebrities, politicians, and religious leaders joined the call for clemency. Even Pope Benedict XVI and former U.S. President Jimmy Carter pleaded with Georgia to stop the execution until new evidence could be reviewed, but each appeal was denied. The courts argued that despite the new claims, there was not enough proof to overturn the conviction. The legal clock kept ticking, and each time Troy Davis came within days of execution, last-minute stays delayed the inevitable. By 2011, he had already faced 3 execution dates. The world was watching, waiting, and hoping for a miracle. But the 4th date, September 21, 2011, would be final. September 21, 2011, the day Troy Davis's life would end, and the day millions around the world would remember. Outside the Georgia State Prison in Jackson, thousands of protesters gathered, holding candles, praying, and chanting his name. Across the world, vigils were being held in front of U.S. embassies, churches, and courthouses. The message was the same everywhere: too much doubt. Inside the prison walls, Troy Davis spent his final hours in quiet reflection. He met with family members one last time, hugged his sister, and spoke to his spiritual advisor. Witnesses said he appeared calm, composed, and peaceful, the same way he had carried himself through more than 2 decades on death row. At 10:30 p.m., he was escorted into the execution chamber. He lay on the gurney, strapped down by his arms and legs, a white sheet covering his body. Through the glass, journalists, officials, and the family of Officer Mark MacPhail watched in silence. When asked if he had any final words, Troy lifted his head slightly and spoke clearly. "I am innocent. I did not personally kill your son, your father, your brother. All I can ask is that you look deeper into this case so you can finally see the truth. May God have mercy on your souls." As the drugs began to flow, witnesses said he kept his eyes open, looking toward the glass until they slowly closed. At 11:08 p.m., Troy Anthony Davis was pronounced dead. Outside, when the news reached the crowd, people broke down in tears. Bells rang in churches across Savannah. Candlelights flickered. And though the execution was over, the debate was only beginning. For many, it felt like America had just executed a man who might have been innocent. For others, it was justice finally carried out. But no one who followed the case could deny that the doubt, the endless, haunting doubt, would never truly die. When the curtain closed that night in Georgia, it wasn't just Troy Davis's life that ended. It was the illusion that the justice system is always certain. His execution became a symbol, a mirror reflecting America's deepest fears about the death penalty, that it could take the life of an innocent man. In the days that followed, protests spread to nearly every major city in the world. The words, "I am Troy Davis," became a rallying cry, a statement about doubt, fairness, and humanity. Across social media, his name trended for days. Newspapers called it the execution that divided a nation. Even those who supported capital punishment admitted that the case had exposed serious cracks in the system. Investigations after his death continued to reveal troubling truths, recanted witnesses, missing evidence, and procedural failures that had been ignored for years. Many asked why, with so much uncertainty, the state refused to grant him even one new trial. But it was too late. The case had already ended with a needle and a clock reading 11:08 p.m. For Troy's family, the pain never left. His sister, Martina Davis Correa, who fought tirelessly for his life even while battling cancer, passed away later that year. In her final speech, she said, "The fight for my brother was never just about him. It was about every innocent man or woman who might face the same fate." Today, Troy Davis's story continues to be studied in law schools, discussed in documentaries, and remembered in movements against wrongful convictions. Whether one believes he was guilty or innocent, his death forced the world to confront a terrifying question. How much doubt is too much when a human life is at stake? That's the story of Troy Anthony Davis, the man who died still claiming innocence and whose final words still echo across the world. The truth will come out one day. What do you think? Was this justice or one of the greatest mistakes in modern American history? Let me know in the comments.